You're sitting across from someone who's hurting. Their words spill out, fractured, desperate, reaching, and without thinking, you've already absorbed it. Their pain lives in your chest now. You can feel the exact weight of it, the specific texture of their grief. You know what they need before they do. But here's what nobody tells you about that gift. Later, when you're alone, you'll realize you've disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally. Somewhere between listening to their story and carrying their burden home with you, you became a ghost in your own life. Your needs, your exhaustion, your quiet desperation, they're still waiting in line. Always waiting. Because when you're the person everyone turns to, when you're the one who feels everything, there's never quite enough space left for you. This is the empathy paradox. The same sensitivity that makes you so attuned to others, so capable of holding space, of reading rooms, of knowing what's left unsaid, is the same mechanism that's slowly eroding your sense of self. You've become so good at feeling for others that you've forgotten how to feel as yourself. And the cruelest part? The thing that once made you feel special, necessary, worthy, your ability to care deeply, has become the very prison you can't escape. Because if you stop caring, if you set a boundary, if you choose yourself for once, then who are you? The fear isn't just rejection, it's existential. It's the terror of discovering that without your usefulness, without your endless capacity to absorb everyone else's chaos, you might not be lovable at all. You learned this early. Maybe you were the child who could sense when your mother's smile was a lie, the one who stayed small and helpful so the tension wouldn't escalate, the little emotional detective who took on the job of managing everyone else's feelings because no one was managing yours. And you got so good at it, so good that it became your identity, your currency, your proof of worth. But survival strategies that work in childhood become prisons in adulthood. The thing that protected you once is now the thing quietly destroying you.
Let's name what this is. Not weakness, not virtue, but a specific psychological configuration born from specific circumstances. What we're examining is hyperempathy, a heightened capacity for emotional attunement that goes beyond typical empathy. It's not just understanding someone else's feelings, it's absorbing them. Neuroscientists call this mirror neuron system overdrive. Your brain doesn't just recognize emotional states in others, it replicates them in your own neural circuitry. You don't observe someone's pain, you become it. This often develops through a process psychologists call parentification, when a child is forced, either explicitly or implicitly, to take on emotional caretaking responsibilities that should belong to adults. You might have been the mediator between fighting parents, the one who learned to read microexpressions to predict when dad's mood would turn, the child who comforted a depressed mother, the translator of unspoken family pain. In these environments, hyperempathy isn't a gift you're born with, it's an adaptation, a survival tool. Your nervous system learned that safety depends on your ability to sense and manage other people's emotional states before they become dangerous. This is what therapists call hypervigilance, a constant state of threat detection, where your amygdala, your brain's alarm system, never fully rests. Even decades later, even in safe environments, you're still scanning, still monitoring, still managing. Over time, this creates what attachment theorists identify as anxious preoccupied attachment, a relational blueprint where your worth becomes contingent on your usefulness to others. Love feels conditional, acceptance feels earned, and rest feels impossible. Because the moment you stop performing care, you believe the relationship will dissolve. But here's what happens on a neurological level. Your default mode network, the brain system responsible for self-referential thinking, for knowing yourself, becomes underactivated. When you spend your entire life focused outward, attuning to others, predicting their needs, your brain literally has less practice thinking about you, your preferences, your boundaries, your internal experience. The result is what trauma-informed psychologists call emotional self-abandonment. Not because you're weak, but because your brain was wired in an environment where abandoning yourself was the only way to stay safe. You learned to split off from your own needs to survive, and that pattern doesn't just disappear when you grow up. It deepens, it professionalizes, it becomes your personality. You become an adult who feels everything except their own anger, who knows everyone's truth except their own, who can hold infinite space for others but feels guilty taking up any themselves. This is the architecture of the empathy paradox, not cruelty, but a nervous system trained to prioritize everyone else's emotional reality over your own.
Let me tell you what this costs. It costs you the ability to sit in a room without immediately sensing who's uncomfortable and trying to fix it. It costs you relationships because you attract people who instinctively know you won't enforce boundaries. It costs you your anger, the righteous, clarifying, protective anger that tells you when something is wrong. You've exiled that part of yourself because anger feels dangerous. Anger might push people away. So you swallow it. You translate it into understanding. You turn it inward. It costs you rest, because rest requires trust, and trust requires believing that the world won't fall apart if you stop holding it together. But your nervous system learned the opposite. It learned that catastrophe lives in the gaps, that if you stop managing, controlling, caring, something terrible will happen. Someone will leave. Someone will hurt themselves. Someone will finally see that you're not actually that special, just useful. Carl Jung spoke of this when he wrote about the persona, the mask we show the world to be acceptable, to be loved. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what happens when your entire sense of self is constructed around being what others need? When your persona isn't a mask you wear, but the only face you know? Then becoming yourself isn't a privilege, it's an act of terrifying rebellion. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas described ethics as being hostage to the other, meaning our fundamental responsibility is to the suffering of others. But what Levinas didn't account for is the person who takes that responsibility so seriously they become actually hostage. The person who mistakes ethical responsibility for self-erasure. This is the invisible grief of the hyper-empathetic. You grieve a self you never got to become. You grieve the version of you that would have existed if someone had cared for you the way you care for everyone else. You grieve the childhood where you got to be a child, messy, needy, uncertain, instead of a tiny therapist managing adult emotions. And the deepest fear, the one that keeps you locked in this pattern, isn't that people won't love you if you stop caretaking, it's that they might. And if they do, you'll have to face the devastating truth that you were always worthy of love, even without performing for it. That all those years of self-abandonment were unnecessary, that you sacrificed yourself for nothing. That grief is unbearable, so instead you stay small, you stay useful, you stay indispensable. Because that pain, the pain of being needed, is at least familiar. It's the devil you know. But this is where the philosophical weight crushes you. You cannot simultaneously honor everyone else's truth and abandon your own. You cannot hold space for others if there's no space inside yourself. You cannot pour from an empty cup, not because it's ineffective, but because eventually you'll shatter the cup entirely trying. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once, with beauty and courage." Your dragon isn't cruelty or selfishness, it's the belief that your needs are a burden, that your existence requires justification, that love is something earned through service rather than something you deserve simply because you exist.
So what does this look like in practice? How does childhood hyperempathy show up in your adult life? In relationships, You might find yourself constantly over-explaining, over-apologizing, over-accommodating. You say, "I'm sorry" for things that aren't your fault because you're managing the emotional atmosphere, always. You might attract narcissistic or emotionally unavailable partners not because you're broken, but because your attunement makes you incredibly good at understanding damaged people. You can see their potential, their wounds. You believe your love can heal them. But what you don't see is that you're repeating the original pattern, earning love through emotional labor. You might also struggle to receive care. When someone offers to help you, your first instinct is to minimize your needs or deflect entirely. "Oh, it's fine, I've got it." Because receiving means being vulnerable. It means admitting you're not the strong one, and your identity is so wrapped up in being the person who doesn't need, who only gives, that vulnerability feels like failure. In your career, you become the person everyone comes to with their problems, the manager who absorbs their team's stress, the colleague who stays late to help everyone else meet deadlines while your own projects languish. You might even choose helping professions, therapy, nursing, teaching, social work, where your hyper-empathy is valued. But you burn out repeatedly because you never learned that professional boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. You might also struggle with imposter syndrome, not because you're incompetent, but because your sense of worth is externally referenced. You need constant validation. You need to know you're doing a good job because you've never developed an internal sense of your own value separate from how useful you are to others. In your sense of self, you might have trouble answering the question, "What do you want?" You genuinely don't know, because what I want was never the relevant question. The relevant question was always, what does everyone else need, and how can I provide it? Your preferences feel trivial. Your desires feel selfish. Your anger feels dangerous. You might experience what therapists call chronic guilt, a low-grade, persistent feeling that you're disappointing someone, failing someone, not doing enough, even when you're objectively doing more than enough, even when you're actively harming yourself to help others. The guilt never lifts because it's not actually about your behavior. It's about the core belief that your existence is a burden that must be justified through constant service. In your emotional regulation, you might feel other people's emotions more strongly than your own. You walk into a room and immediately sense the tension, the unspoken conflict, the hidden sadness, and you can't not respond. You can't leave it alone. Your nervous system interprets other people's distress as your emergency. So you fix, you soothe, you mediate, even when nobody asked you to. But when it comes to your own emotions, numbness, confusion, or the opposite, overwhelming floods of feeling that you can't name or contain because you never learned emotional literacy for yourself. You only learned it for others. In your boundaries, they're non-existent or rigid. Either you have no boundaries at all, you give and give and give until you're completely depleted, or you swing the opposite direction and build walls so high nobody can reach you because you haven't learned that boundaries can be flexible, that they're not rejection, that saying no doesn't mean I don't love you. It means I also love myself. You might also experience what's called boundary guilt, a crushing sense of shame and anxiety every time you try to set a limit, even reasonable limits, even necessary ones, because your nervous system interprets boundaries as abandonment, as the thing that will finally prove you're unlovable. But here's what you need to understand. These aren't character flaws. These are adaptations. You developed these patterns because they worked. They kept you safe in an environment where safety was conditional, where love was earned, where your emotional labor purchased connection. The unlearning process begins with witnessing rather than fixing. It begins with noticing the pattern without immediately judging it. There it is again. I'm apologizing for something I didn't do. I'm taking responsibility for someone else's feelings. I'm abandoning my own needs to manage theirs. The goal isn't to stop caring. The goal is to care differently, to expand your circle of care to include yourself, to recognize that your needs are not less important than everyone else's. They're not a distraction from the real work of caring for others. They are the work. Because you cannot sustainably give what you haven't received. You cannot model healthy relationships if you're in an abusive relationship with yourself. You cannot teach others to honor their needs if you're constantly dishonoring your own. This is the beginning of the unlearning, recognizing that the version of you that everyone relies on was never the full you. It was the survival you, the adapted you, the you that learned to disappear to stay safe. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to let that version rest, to honor what it did for you, and to begin the slow, terrifying, beautiful work of becoming who you actually are underneath all that service.
So, how do you heal from this? How do you unwind decades of self-abandonment? First, reparenting the inner child. You begin by meeting the part of you that never got to just be a kid. The part that had to be hypervigilant and useful and emotionally mature far too early. You speak to that part with the tenderness nobody offered them. You tell them, you don't have to earn my love. You don't have to perform. You don't have to manage my feelings or predict my needs. You can just exist, and that's enough. This isn't abstract. This is a practice. When you notice yourself overfunctioning, you pause and ask, what would I say to a child who felt this way? And then you say it to yourself. Second, shadow work. You reclaim the parts of yourself you exiled to stay acceptable. Your anger, your selfishness, your messiness, your needs. These aren't character flaws to overcome. They're human experiences you're entitled to. Shadow work means making peace with the fact that you contain multitudes, that you can be kind and angry, generous and boundaried, caring and self-protective. Third, nervous system regulation. Your body learned that safety means constant vigilance. You retrain it. Through somatic practices, breathwork, movement, meditation, therapy, you teach your nervous system that it can rest, that you can let your guard down, that other people's emotions are not your emergency. This might mean literally interrupting the pattern when you feel yourself scanning the room for tension. You place a hand on your chest. You take a deep breath. You remind yourself, this is not my responsibility. I am safe even if I don't fix this. Fourth, choosing softness over survival mode. You begin to experiment with being less helpful, less available, less attuned. Not because you're becoming callous, but because you're creating space. Space for others to solve their own problems. Space for your own needs to emerge. Space to discover who you are when you're not performing care. This will feel excruciating at first. Your nervous system will scream that you're doing it wrong, that people will leave, that you're being selfish. But gradually, you'll notice something. The people who truly love you don't leave when you stop overfunctioning. The relationships that end were never about you. They were about what you could provide. And the ones that remain, they become real. Because for the first time, people are seeing you. Not the helpful version, not the accommodating version, but you. Fifth, building a different relationship with empathy. Your empathy isn't the problem. The problem is what you've been taught to do with it. You don't need to become less empathetic. You need to extend that empathy inward. To feel your own pain with the same tenderness you offer everyone else. To recognize your own needs with the same urgency you recognize theirs. Brené Brown says, compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. You've been operating as if you're the healer and everyone else is wounded. But what if you're also wounded? What if your pain also deserves to be held? What if the most revolutionary thing you could do is admit that you're tired, that you need help, that you don't have all the answers, that sometimes you just need someone to see you, not for what you can do, but for who you are? Here's what I want you to know. The goal is not to be fixed. You're not broken. You never were. The goal is to become whole. And becoming whole means integrating the parts of yourself you've been hiding. The needy part, the angry part, the part that wants to be taken care of, the part that's exhausted from decades of emotional labor disguised as love. Your empathy is a gift, but not when it's used as a weapon against yourself, not when it becomes the mechanism of your own erasure. You deserve to exist in your full humanity, messy, contradictory, imperfect, and beautifully, defiantly you. Not as a function for others, but as a complete being in your own right. The people who love you don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present. And you can't be present when you're constantly performing,
when you're constantly managing, when you're constantly abandoning yourself to make space for everyone else. So maybe it's time to put down the burden, time to stop earning love you were always worthy of, time to discover who you are when you're not busy being everything for everyone. The world won't fall apart if you rest, but you might finally come together. If this resonated with you, if you saw yourself in these patterns, know that you're not alone. Thousands of others are walking this same path, learning to care for themselves with the same devotion they've always offered others. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and if you found value here, subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology of being human. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. You've carried enough.